Hello, I'm Helena Clayton, and alongside my work in organisational and leadership development as a coach and as a facilitator, I've had a long-standing interest in love and the role that it could and arguably should play in organisations. So in this series of conversations, I'm going to be talking to some people who share that interest, some from the corporate world, but not all by any means. We have an Everest explorer and an academic for you to hear from. And together we'll be talking about what difference more love might make in organisations. What do we mean by love in a secular, in a workplace sense? What blocks and enables love to flow? And perhaps more importantly, or most importantly, what are acts of leadership that are acts of loving leadership? So there'll be some more details about where to find more information at the end of this session. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you on the other side. Hello folks, so today I am delighted to be talking with Dr. James Traeger, a long-time colleague and friend of mine, and I'm really thrilled to be chatting with him today. And James and I first met each other probably 15 years ago, maybe more, when we worked together at Roffey Park. And then when James left Roffey and set up Maven, I left Roffey, I joined Maven as one of their associates. And if you don't know Maven, please check them out. I'll send a link at the end of this program. And in fact, James was one of the first people, part of a small group, who first heard me say, do you know what? I think I'm really interested in love and the role that it could and should play in organisations. So James was there when this journey began, so he's the perfect person to be talking to today. So yeah, welcome James, really good to be here with you.
Yeah, lovely to be with you. And as you say, it is lovely to see this project flourishing when I was there at the kind of the outset, as it were. It's brilliant to see it.
Right. And I often start, and I will today, by asking you, what is it about who you are and about you that means you are able, willing, up for a conversation about love, because it remains a tricky, problematic, sometimes taboo topic to be talking about, yet not for you. So what is it about you that makes this kind of conversation, more than okay?
Thank you. Great question to start with. So there are a number of thoughts, one of which is around what's sometimes talked about as the kind of undiscussable in organizations. And I think one of the things that I think drives our work in Maven is bringing what is generally undiscussable into the kind of foreground, because it's often the reason why you get kind of difficulties and blocks and challenges in organizations, and also where the opportunities and the gold is. And so for me, kind of putting love front and center is bringing something that's generally a bit undiscussable into the foreground. So I suppose that would be my starting point.
And if you go back into your own life, again, are there any kind of connections there that means you're okay and more than okay and interested in love and happy to talk about love and other undiscussables?
Well, it's sort of like, how could you not, really? At one level, I suppose, you know, when you talk about love, the first thing that comes into my mind is my relationship with my family, and particularly my children, I would say. There's something incredibly powerful about that kind of relationship that has driven my identity ever since I sort of became a parent, and was a kind of fulcrum point in my identity from the moment between not being a parent and becoming a parent. And I remember it really clearly when my son was born. So that kind of the creation of love through, you know, being a father, I think has been a kind of driving force in my life. So how could it not be an important subject?
Yes. Yeah. And as we begin, what One of the things I asked you before we started recording was, what's on your mind with regard to love? And there was a fantastic syllabus that we sort of mapped out. So same
Mm,
question, really. Now we are recording.
mm.
When you think about love and a conversation here today, where might you want to go?
Yeah.
Might you be curious about?
Well, to continue that thought about my kids, particularly my relationship with my son, because it was relevant to, it's not that I love him more than I love my daughter, by the way, but as you know, I did a PhD at the University of Bath in action research, and that was around masculinity in organizations. It was about, men and their relationship to their organizations that they're in. And that drew me inevitably into my relationship with my son at the time. And there was a poem, actually. There was a line from a poem, and it was, "And the feel of your tiny finger wrapped around my hand has made more of a man of me than I could ever make of myself." And it was this idea, it's from a guy called Abraham Gibson, and it was the idea that actually that relationship was the making of me. And this was in contrast to this idea of the self-made man, the airport bookshop man who, in that incredibly narcissistic kind of Donald Trump-esque way, makes himself. And for me, that kind of relationship with others that's fundamentally about love is a huge contrast in the understanding of what it is to be a man in our society from the kind of mainstream idea of masculinity, which is very individualized and very macho and very heroic and very isolated. So that for me is, is essentially rooted in love as a process. And that was a bit of revelation for me personally, but also I think an issue in organizations, because I think organizations are driven by that kind of macho, heroic leadership notion of, the heroic man. So love is the antidote to that, I think.
So let me pick up on love as a process then, because we often talk about love as a thing.
Yeah.
Which arguably could be a masculine way of looking at it. But I wonder if you could say more about what you mean, what you see as love being a process, as opposed to or as well as a thing.
Yeah, well, that idea of love as a process, as a kind of particularly masculine idea or particularly sort of Western idea, I think is the key here. I think so much of what we talk about in our lives and in organizations is what I call thingified, turned into a thing. Our relationships, the stuff that organizations are looking for, engagement, motivation, they're all nouns, aren't they? As if they're a thing. And love is in itself is also a bit of a noun in the way that we tend to talk about it. And I think what that does is it misunderstands the very kind of fluid, moving, changing, dynamic notion, well, not notion, experience of what love is and what all those other things are that organizations are after, which is why they so misunderstand them, because they generally appoint someone, and the worst thing that can happen to your work, Helena, is that organizations start appointing kind of directors of love, because they'll be kind of thingified, in the role. It's a bit like the director of OD or the director of people or whatever. They, as soon as that happens, that person gets associated with that quality or that thing, and then everyone else stops being responsible for it, and it's become thingified. And that for me is a misunderstanding of what something like love is, which is an ongoing, experienced process, which happens and also needs ongoing work, rather than, love. It's that famous sonnet about love, isn't it? Which I think is part of the problem, this idea of love being a constant, when alteration finds, I think, from Shakespeare. And of course, actually, I don't believe that. I think love needs constant maintenance. constant work,
Yeah.
and isn't a fixed thing, a never fixed mark. Um, so that for me is what I mean by a process. Sort of, it needs work. Like everything needs work.
And it sounds like it's something that, a bit like the whole kind of complex adaptive processes, it happens in the micro moments
Yeah,
between you and me,
yeah,
and the tiniest things, the tiniest ways that we be and do together,
yeah,
um,
yeah,
that is contributing to
yeah.
love. We are, yeah.
And it's really supporting, I think, a movement in the world such that anybody's interested in it of organizational theory in the academy and in universities. I got hold of a very new book written by a esteemed social theorist professor, Caroline Pedwell, and she talks about revolutionary routines and this idea that change happens in the small stuff, in the process of the small, not in the heroic big. And that actually it's about habits. It's about ongoing habits and how we shift our habits. And she tells quite a good, moving story in the preface about her own insomnia, actually, and how she shifted that through, the work of habits, and that this is where change really happens. And increasingly, the intellectual world is recognizing that processes like love happen on an ongoing and small change basis rather than heroic basis. And if you think about love, the amount of love that goes on in a family, in an organization, in a system, in a community is all about those small moments of exchange that are going on all the time, that are so kind of regular that we miss them, don't we? Or we fail to notice them as such because they're ongoing and happening. And from someone helping someone else out to a parent and a baby interacting to all these incredible things that are going on all the time, the small things that matter.
So then, if we think of those of us who are interested in creating or enabling cultures in organizations where people can flourish, etc. What does that mean we need to pay more attention to? Those folks in leadership roles or in change agent roles or in OD roles, what does that mean for the way we need to be, show up, work in organizations?
Yeah. Well, I think it's about anxiety, actually, because I think most organizational activity, particularly of late, in the wake of or in the experience of pandemic and lockdown, is driven by anxiety. It's driven by fear and the ongoing experience of fear, which turns into that kind of nervous anxiety, which shuts things down, which limits people, which pushes organizations towards control, which creates enormous bureaucracy, which deteriorates trust, which creates that kind of exhaustion that most people I experience, I connect with these days experience. And so sort of the possibility of love to kind of open, the embodied experience of love, to open compassion, to intend connection, to let go of knowing, to open up vulnerability, to kind of be, comfortable enough with uncertainty and ambiguity. The root of that, the ability to be compassionate, to be open enough, enabling enough, of all of what leaders need to do in order to kind of let go a bit and hold up the ceiling. There must be love in there somewhere. Don't you think?
I really, yes, I do. And what I was noticing was, for those of you just listening, not watching, is your gestures, James, were opening, right? So I often talk about love, kind of metaphorically, really, but maybe embodied too, as about expansion somehow, you know,
Yeah.
making room, seeing
Yeah.
the bigger picture, allowing things in. But definitely something, if fear is about constriction and tightening, then for me, love feels about loosening and expansion and opening,
Yeah.
which there's something about that, I think, in what you're saying.
Yes. And, you know, one of the things that we notice at the moment and we're thinking about actually is the perennial speaking truth to power thing.
Mm.
And I mean, I think people learning how to speak truth to power is very important, but I also think equally important, but what gets less attention is the ability of senior leaders, or not the ability, the capacity, which is a different thing because it's to do with that expansion. The capacity of senior leaders to be able to hear the truth.
Mm.
And that's a skill set.
Mm.
You know, that's to do with the practice of being able to open and expand and withstand the anxiety and the experience of difficulty that most people have in organizations when they're a senior leader, where they kind of spend most of their day, actually, I think, days and nights perhaps, just absorbing that anxiety and that, you know, confusion and distress. And then, you know, some poor fellow comes along having gone on a course to speak truth to power and tells them the last thing that they want to hear because they know it, you know, at one level and maybe only semi-consciously, but then they've got someone else telling them it. It's a big ask, isn't it? So again, I think love sort of serves a purpose in perhaps enabling that expansion that you're talking about, that emotional, physical, somatic kind of capability plays a role in leaders being able to hear the truth, you know, or hear truths being spoken.
And interestingly, where that takes me is the world of improvisation. And I'm no impro girl at all, really, but I do know the phrase "yes and" comes directly from improvisation. So it's like everything is a gift, everything is available to you, everything is for you. So there's something loving about that. You know, how can we welcome anything and everything with a yes and, as opposed, you know, which is an expansive, allowing mindset, I guess, as opposed to a yes but or a pushing away or a fear-based defensiveness. Yeah. So again, this theme of expansion and allowing in.
And I think it's about, as part of that kind of yes and is the capability that we need to be leaders of complex organizations at the moment, and communities. Actually, I think it's more about communities than organizations in some ways, to be able to kind of manage tensions and paradoxes and binaries that tend to kind of slip into either or. I mean, as you know, I come from a Jewish background, and we're right in the middle of the whole kind of regular cycle of silliness that goes on in the in Israel Palestine. And one of the things that happens when you're Jewish and you live in a country like Britain is that you get people coming up to you when that sort of thing's going on and saying, "What do you think?" As if you kind of have to be able to kind of at one level kind of explain the whole thing to them, which is only, you know, about 500 years of history, and also kind of give them a settled position, so that they can have a settled position. And, you know, at one level, I respect that. You know, I respect that kind of need actually that we have. But on the other hand, it's very difficult because it's very, you know, one of the things I end up saying to people is don't take sides. It doesn't help to take sides. You know, it's very easy to slip into that kind of, you know, good good and bad, evil and good, or righteous and disreputable, or whatever. And it's not helpful. It's not helpful to take sides. And it's not helpful within the system to take sides, and it's not helpful outside the system to take sides. And unfortunately, that leads to difficulty for people because it's ambiguous and it's unclear and it's not easy to know what to do. And actually, in a lot of these situations, there is nothing to do. There's nothing else you can do that helps. And in fact, more doing is the one thing the system doesn't need. So,
and that makes me then wonder what role love plays in this. How can love help us not take sides or sit with the not knowing? Any thoughts on that?
well, yeah, I mean, I think it's rooted in love, because I think it is actually the ability to withstand, the need to take sides and the need to make sense of what is quite often senseless, literally senseless, is rooted in love, isn't it? It's our ability to be compassionate, our ability to listen, our ability to just be a witness, and to hold that noticing and that witnessing and that experiencing, and within the sight of terrible things, that must be rooted in love. It's got to be, again, it's got to be in there somewhere. If it's a process, I'm trying not to thingify it, and not say it is about love or it isn't about love. It's just got to be in there somewhere, is how I would put it. It's got to be in the mix, hasn't it? It's got to be at some point some important wellspring of our experience.
And I'm just before the recent bout of fighting kicked off, I'd read a really powerful book for me called A Paragon, Colin McCann, about a Jewish man and a Palestinian man, both of whom had daughters killed in the fighting 10 years apart, and of their friendship and their getting to know each other, getting to understand each other's sides, and how they work together with others to tell their story of two men coming together with love and in hope, in tiny ways, to try and make a difference. And that was very much a story of love, in so many ways.
Yeah. And there are so many stories like that. Again, it's like the small things that matter.
Right.
What we don't hear on the news is all the work that's being done on the ground on both sides to not sink into the narrative that's blasted at us by both sides, who have leaderships that have a vested interest in projecting a certain image, mostly of victimhood. And that's a game that is being played, and that game is very seductive for people, because it's very easy for us to fall into it.
And in organizations, right, there'll be a organizational version of that game, a team version of that game being played all the time too.
It reminds me of that wonderful famous TED talk, the dangers of a single story, that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, where she basically says, the problem is not about the story. The problem is with a single story that we believe as the story. And her work as a Nigerian author, which it's about, having a multiplicity of stories. I think that's what she talks about. And again, that, love must be in there somewhere to understand that multiplicity of stories.
And Charles Eisenstein, I think, said, about the dangers of defining something, which is where we began, right? Love not as a thing. Because when we define something, we risk cutting off nuance and shearing off, subtlety and nuance and possibility. We box it in. And I noticed this in the research I did. I asked about love before defining what love was, and I noticed how easy it is actually for many of us to talk about love without defining it, because we know it. at some level. And I can see why many people would want a little more definition. Yeah. So the dangers of boxing, limiting, defining too tightly.
And it's a habit, isn't it? That goes on in organizations about lots of things. Well, in order to do something, in order to change something, we've got to define what it is. We've got to have a project definition or whatever it might be. And of course, how unhelpful that might be if it is something that is a process. And we don't make life easier for people by inviting them to see things in much more sort of variegated ways. We don't make it easy, because actually it's so much easier for people to have a clear kind of, this is what it is and this is what it isn't. And of course, unfortunately, that's not what life is like. It's not what, the more than human world is like. It's not what the human world is like. There's a really good book by, I think it's Adam Rutherford, which is about how to argue with a racist. And I read it, and it's brilliant. It's really good if you want to ever argue with a racist, which I don't particularly. But one of the things he talks about is how when you start to look at genetics, for example, which right back into the 20th century was used as a reason just to justify racism through scientific means, the distinctions all break down. They all break down. It becomes much more complicated, much more nuanced, much more problematic to talk about qualities of genetic development being defined by in racial terms. And of course, as a Jewish person, that problematizes my Jewish identity, because actually that whole idea of Judaism as a race, Jewishness as a race, disappears out the window, because genetically it just doesn't stand up. Having said that, just because it problematizes it, makes it, much more complex, that doesn't detract from it. In fact, it makes it more interesting in some ways. And I think that might be the same for something like love. How interesting it becomes when it's not easily defined.
Right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think there are some, and I work with them actually with groups, some very clear things. People say, well, love is, care, nurture, great listening, generosity. And there are some very kind of behavioral things that we can look at and say, yeah, if I do those, odds on it's angling towards love. And though, for me, what's always interesting is exploring love through less obvious ways. Love as hope, anger, and love, what the relationship there is. Love as a form of expansion, allyship. So I love the exploration that takes us into new territories to see what we can bring back from there that may be useful to us in organizations. Yeah.
What did you learn about anger and love?
Oh, well, for me, it's a wholly legitimate part of love. I think it's tricky, though. I think I go to a place of Satish Kumar says this, as do lots of people. We protect what we love. So first, we need to work out what matters to us enough to protect. And one way to work that out for ourselves, because very often we don't know, is to think about what gets us angry, or what pisses us off in the world, or what's not okay in the world, or for ourselves or for other people. So connecting to our righteous anger, not kind of rageful acting out anger, but connecting to a sense of righteous anger allows us to really claim, for me, what we love, and therefore what we will cross the road to do something about. So there's a kind of a warrior energy that is part of love, that says this is not okay, that says no really firmly, both in terms of social justice or climate justice, or to my own personal boundaries. So I think it's and the goddess Kali in Indian mythology, even though she's presented as a goddess of anger with blood and death and destruction, from what I know, she does it in service of love. She's also seen as a mother goddess. So again, there's a long history of links between anger and love. I don't know if that.
Yeah, there's a Jewish version of Kali which is called the Shekinah, which is
Mm.
the female face in Kabbalah
Mm.
of God. There's a it's the William Blake quote, isn't it? Of righteous indignation is the voice of God.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so that's that kind of the force. I one of the things that really again pushes a button for me is that kind of idea that there's positive and negative emotions.
Yes.
Because actually anger can be an incredibly positive thing.
I'm a big fan of anger. Yes.
So there's something about how acknowledging the whole of human experience and then noticing that what creates positivity and negativity in it is what we do with it, not what it is.
Right. Fabulous.
Yeah.
James, I think we could talk for a lot longer, and
Okay.
hopefully we will. Well, I know we'll continue this conversation. But for now, let me just check out with you before we close. Is there anything else that that you really want to say before we press pause on this conversation?
I think, well, firstly, for me, it's lovely to do this. So it's sort of a proof of the kind of the social construction, that actually by talking about it, it becomes manifests. So it's lovely to do it, and that's lovely. And I think again, it's a reminder of how much of it for me is sort of in the moment. And I know that when I'm kind of motivated to kind of write things down or paint or make a sculpture or do something, it's motivated by wanting to kind of capture the experience, which actually can't be really, because the experience is the experience. And in a way that's sort of lovely and shows how much human creativity is driven by that process, but also it's quite tragic because it's gone. And that again is something I think that is one of the reasons why we work so hard to thingify it, because we're always trying to crystallize it when actually it's something that's very fluid. So yeah, that's, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I'm joining on we go. And ultimately that's about by way of saying thank you. This has been lovely.
Likewise, I always loved our conversations, and this one has been absolutely no different. You bring such heart and intellect and curiosity, and that's beautiful for everyone, I think. So thank you so much. And it's a Friday as we're recording this, so yeah, wishing you a lovely weekend.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks, Helena.
So I hope you found something of interest there and things to stimulate your thinking. For more information, head over to my website, helenaclayton.co.uk. There you'll find the show notes from this conversation, plus links to my blog page, a way to sign up to my newsletter, my Leading from Love program, and a lot more. And drop me a line, find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, of course. It would be great to connect with you that way too. Okay, bye for now.